what will the city be? What will the city be, or community be in the future? What's our sense collectively about what the entire city is going to look like leaning forward in terms of planning? And particularly, how do we engage in a system that will allow us to ensure that it is inclusive, that all interests are accounted for, and that all of us see our vision of being part of Oakland as a piece of what we're advancing through this exercise. And one of the most important components, and we'll have more elaboration in a moment, of the elements that are being examined through this update is the housing element. I don't need to express to anyone in this community what a critical aspect of housing and housing affordability plays in the work we have in examining our community and enhancing our community, and in, again, making sure that there is a place for all of us in it. So I'm really looking forward to this being the beginning of many conversations we have with many constituents across the city around this critical element. And we'll have a presentation also that sets this in the context of the broader work. We've got a lot of great expertise in the room this evening, and I'm going to turn this over to Lakshmi, who is our project manager and has been doing a fantastic job getting us out the gate. So Lakshmi, thank you very much. And then you can also proceed in presenting the team, and let's have a good working session this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Gilchrist. Good evening, everybody. Welcome and thank you for attending the first of many workshops planned for the general plan update and the housing element update. My name is Lakshmi Rajagopalan, and as Director Gilchrist mentioned, I am the project manager for this project. With me, I have staff from the city and the consultant team. So if everybody, so I'll just call on everybody, and then if you can just wave your hand and do a quick, just introduce yourselves, that'll be great. Laura. Laura Kaminsky.
Oh, sorry. Laura Kaminsky, and the strategic planning manager for the city.
Ed Manassi.
Yes, hello. This is Ed Manassi, Deputy Director of Planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Rajiv Bhatia.
Hi.
Alison Moore.
Hello, everyone.
And we also have other team members from city staff and from the consultant team as well. So this is today's agenda. So we will be giving a quick overview of the general plan update process and how the update is going to happen until 2025. And we will also provide a quick overview of the housing element update and the purpose of today's meeting. And we will also have breakout room small group discussions. And that's where we will have a lot of input, and we will we will have discussions. And between 7:40 and 7:55, we will report back and identify the next steps moving forward. So I wanted to do a quick review of today's meeting protocol. This meeting is happening on Zoom and will be recorded for future viewing. As I mentioned earlier, we will have discussions in breakout rooms, and breakout facilitators will have an asterisk or a star next to their name. So please be respectful and please allow space for everybody else to talk. Please also mute yourself if you're not actively speaking. So when we put in the registration form for this meeting, we had asked if people wanted interpretation or translation requests, but we did not get any. However, we have Spanish and Cantonese interpreters available at this meeting. So if you require translation in Spanish or Cantonese, please raise your hand and we will assign you to separate breakout rooms for the presentation. The Cantonese, can we have the Cantonese translation and the Spanish translation, please?
Hey, Paris, can you translate?
Yes, sure. From the start?
Paris, can you translate?
Yes, sure.
Just for the request.
Ujú. En este caso, en anteriores juntas, hemos tenido solicitudes de traducción del español o traducción del cantonés. Si usted acaso requiere traducción al español, por favor levante su mano para que se le mande a un cuarto separado de la junta, donde ustedes recibirán la junta y los materiales de manera que serían traducidos al español. Levante su mano en este momento si requiere usted traducción de español. Anyone raised their hands? That was for Spanish interpretation.
There are no hands raised. I do not see any hand raised.
There are no hands raised. Let me try again.
Hi, this is Diana. This is Diana Molina, resident of Oakland, 7. My suggestion is, if there's no one on the call that requires interpretation, maybe those folks can take those so we can share it for folks, community members who can't be here. That's just a suggestion. I'm not sure of the capacity. Thank you.
I think we can move on to the next slide, Alison. So the general plan, next slide, please. Thank you. So what is the general plan? The general plan is the guiding document for the city, and it provides a consistent direction for equitable development. It also provides an opportunity to engage our community in the planning and decision-making processes and reduce racial inequities. Most of the city's current general plan was developed over 20 years. And with this comprehensive update of the general plan, the city has the opportunity to advance its commitment to create a fair and just city and undo past harms and inequity through more robust and equitable goals, policies, and implementation measures. Next slide, please. The general plan establishes a citywide vision and supporting goals, policies, and implementation measures around equitable development of housing, open space, built environment, and transportation. It also impacts who's able to stay and make sure that there is, we provide space for everybody in Oakland to find equitable housing and access community facilities. Next slide, please. The general plan update is occurring in 2 phases because some of the elements must be adopted sooner than the others due to state law requirements. State law requires cities to prepare regular updates to the housing element to address the housing needs of residents in all income levels and as a precondition for affordable housing funds. This next update is due by January 31st, 2023. Per state law, the safety element and the new environmental justice element must be adopted upon adoption of the housing element. While we have begun this process with the housing element, baseline racial equity and environmental justice analysis is currently happening and will intersect across all the elements to encourage equitable housing locations, decrease pollution exposure, increase community assets, and improve overall community health and well-being. Next slide, please. There are also other elements that need to be covered, such as open space, conservation and recreation, noise, land use, and transportation. And the general plan can also cover optional elements and topics. And this update will include a new infrastructure and facilities element that will identify overarching goals and policies for the city's infrastructure over the long term. Next slide, please. So this is the schedule for phase 1 of the general plan update. As I mentioned, because there are certain requirements to adopt some elements sooner than the others, the general plan update is divided into 2 phases. So there are a variety of outreach activities such as workshops, pop-ups, community hub events that are planned throughout this process. And as I mentioned before, we are in the midst of preparing background studies, and we will also be preparing a vision, guiding principles, and equity framework as well as those 3 elements that I mentioned. And this work will carry on in phase 2 until 2025 with ongoing outreach. In phase 2, we will update the land use and transportation element, open space conservation and recreation element, noise, and develop a new infrastructure and facilities element. The work that we are doing in phase 2 will kind of build on the work that we are doing in phase 1.
Great, thanks, Lakshmi. As Lakshmi mentioned, we have about a year to develop the element structured around state mandated periods of review for the public and for the state itself to review the draft. As with the general plan process, inclusive engagement is absolutely key. While there will be several types of community engagement throughout the entire year, we will have a period of focused engagement, including housing-specific activities like these workshops and stakeholder group meetings. Those are occurring now and into the spring. So there will be 4 workshops for the community to come together and come up with solutions and opportunities to address the housing crisis. Today, we'll introduce the housing element and share more about considerations for where housing should go. At workshop 2, next week on the 17th, we'll cover more of Oakland's housing needs and key trends, including what groups are affected, and ask you for your ideas about potential strategies and solutions. At workshop 3 in March, we'll talk more specifically about ways to preserve affordable housing, protecting tenants, and anti-displacement strategies, as we know that these are key community concerns. At workshop 4, the public review of the housing element will be underway and available. That will include the full housing sites inventory and key strategies and housing actions. And we'll vet with you to make sure that this reflects what you told us. I want to emphasize, and Lakshmi mentioned it too, that the housing element will cover many of the concerns that we've already heard about, including affordability, addressing homelessness, and helping Oaklanders remain in their neighborhoods. But other concerns can be addressed in other elements that are occurring both in phase 1 and phase 2, the environmental justice and safety elements in phase 1, and land use and transportation, among others, in phase 2. And there will be various opportunities beyond these workshops to also talk about how housing intersects with environmental justice and safety. Our community consultant team, known as the Deeply Rooted Collaborative, represents a consortium of community-based organizations in Oakland with deep roots, many with deep community action and organizing experience as well. They are hosting fun, celebratory cultural hub events, pop-up events, engaging youth. They have an equity working group. They're doing these in Oakland neighborhoods themselves, and they will engage the community directly about general plan topics, including housing. Here's just a list of a few key scheduled events happening this month, including some advisory groups. Please check the website to sign up for updates so you can get all of the dates moving forward in the future as well. So now I just want to pause and give you all the opportunity to tell us why you're here. We want to get to know you, what brings you out here tonight. We have an online polling tool called Mentimeter. You can access through the link in the chat. Hazel, if you could drop that link in the chat for everyone. If you can't access Mentimeter, totally fine. You can chat into the Zoom chat as we go along with these questions. So with that, tell us, what brings you to this workshop here tonight? And people are welcome to put their responses in the chat if Mentimeter's not working.
This link will take you outside of Zoom, but you should be able to keep the Zoom meeting open, go to thementimeter.com. You can go on your phone. It will populate as people start to answer.
So a quick note, there are some people saying that they are unable to see the entire PowerPoint, that the PowerPoint is cut. I think if you can you try turning off the chat and maybe the participant name, because it is showing fine on my end. I'm not sure how it is showing for everybody else. So
yeah, if you go to the view options in the top right of the screen where the image is, you can decide how, if you want the entire image to fit on the screen, zoom in or zoom out. So you need to do that.
We have some answers in the chat. Randy says he's here to act on housing to provide more and overcome the various hurdles that always prevent it from happening. Ira Starr is here to point out the impossibility of true community engagement and the predictable cookie cutter housing element that will result. Robin retired from affordable housing. She has over 25 years of experience. Tiffany is a member of the Deeply Rooted Collaborative with the Unity Council. Phoenix wants to see Oakland develop a housing first model where housing the unhoused is the #1 priority and everything else is deprioritized until we have everyone housed.
I also have a comment directly sent to me. So it's about, we need to have more extremely low income housing in Oakland. We need to have reasonable placement of occupants.
Oops, sorry about that. And then the next question, what neighborhood do you live, work, or have a business in? I'm seeing answers for Rockridge, downtown, Grand Lake, West Oakland, Mosswood, some people from the city, East Oakland, Bushrod. Great, it's great to see people from all over Oakland here, and as well as beyond. And then what do people love about Oakland? Oops, the people. Want more of them. Walkable, friendly neighbors, the culture of Oakland, proximity to important spots. Great, thank you all for this input. And then I will note that we will have the chat saved. So all of your answers are stored, so thank you. Great. Seeing a lot of people, the culture in Oakland. People showing up. Getting some notes that I should be quiet, so I will hush for another minute. Yeah, I'm having some issues refreshing the Mentimeter, but it includes all of the, it captures all of the comments. So we will share the results of the Mentimeter on the website as well. Great, maybe just one more minute. And then I will get to, oh, there we go. All right, well, thank you everyone for sharing why you're here tonight and what you love about the neighborhood where you live or work or have a business. Welcome. So next, the housing element. Why were we here tonight? So the housing element for Oakland, it's the blueprint for housing all Oaklanders over the next 8 years. As required by law, all California cities, towns, and counties must plan for the housing needs of all their residents. This requirement is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA. You may have heard that acronym. The RHNA determines the total number of new homes that Oakland needs to build and how affordable those homes need to be in order to meet the housing needs of people at all income levels. This number comes from the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG, which is the regional planning agency Oakland is a part of. And then Oakland, or ABAG gets their direction for these number of units from the state. So for this last housing cycle, that is the 8 years before this one, Oakland received a total RENA of 14,765 housing units. And while the city did meet its RENA numbers overall, it fell short of meeting the need for all income levels except for units affordable to above moderate incomes. You can see the percentages here of the income categories that they've made progress on. This time around, the RENA is nearly double what it used to be. This means the housing element will need to identify focused strategies and programs to help meet its allocations for very low, and moderate income levels. The housing element is more than meeting a number, though. It's also about addressing the specific needs of Oakland's people. So there are 3 major parts to the housing element. The first part is a background analysis, which includes an assessment of what worked well last cycle and how things could be changed or improved. An assessment of housing needs and trends that includes affordability, housing quality, needs of specific groups in Oakland, including Oakland's unhoused population, people with disabilities, larger families, and more. We're going to talk a lot more about that at the next workshop. The background analysis also seeks to make sure that Oaklanders have fair housing choices, meaning that no matter who you are, you can seek or secure housing fairly, no matter where it is in the city. The sites inventory is the second part, and that includes the locations of where Oakland will plan for this housing. That's what we're going to talk about today. And then the action plan, which is one of the most important parts, is what the city commits to doing to address this need or removing barriers. So in essence, the housing element must do 2 things. It has to plan for adequate housing sites, and then it also has to set forth strategies, programs, and actions to meet the need, both for RENA, both for specific housing needs and needs of the people. So as we look forward, it's important to also reflect on how we got here. Oakland, like many cities in America, has a legacy of institutionalized racism and discrimination that has affected geographic disparities and inequities to this day. An intentional race and equity-centered approach is the only way to plan for a future where every Oaklander thrives. It's also important to acknowledge that the city's role is only one part of the housing solution, and that it will take everyone, including nonprofits, businesses, advocacy organizations, foundations, property owners, tenants, and most importantly, members of the community themselves to address this important issue. So considering equity is one of the most important parts of determining where housing will go. It's also a legal requirement. The housing locations, they must affirmatively further fair housing by overcoming patterns of segregation and fostering inclusive communities. There are other conditions for housing locations that are required by the state as well, including whether or not it is in a constrained area. I'll talk about what that means in the next few slides. Or whether its location helps people meet their needs. Is it close to transportation? Is it accessible? Is it in a community where people's needs can be met? Is it served by water and sewer and infrastructure? The state also prefers for housing locations that are intended to accommodate very low and low income housing be a certain size or acreage. That's another consideration. And it also must be able to accommodate a certain number of residential units on that acreage. That's called density. And for many metro areas like Oakland, the density sweet spot that the state wants to see is 30 units per acre or more. I'm going to drop in the chat a link to more information about what the state's looking for sites. So constraints, what are those? Constraints in Oakland, they're similar to other Bay Area communities. Oakland does have a very high risk of wildfire in the hills. Some people may recall the fires of '91. There is a fault line, the Hayward Fault, that runs through the East Bay. Sea level rise and flooding is also a concern, as well as proximity to pollution hazards that can include industrial land uses or old underground storage tanks that may be leaking, or proximity to highways that could cause air pollution. The disproportionate impacts that these hazards have on some groups like low-income families or communities of color is both a housing and an environmental justice consideration. As I mentioned, to affirmatively further fair housing, housing sites, programs, and actions should also promote integration and reduce segregation. While Oakland is a diverse city, it's also segregated. So according to recent data, Oakland is largely a mix of tracts that have 3 or 4 groups of people, but by this metric, diversity is 5 groups or people, and there are only 2 tracts in the city that meet that definition. Fair housing means that all racial and ethnic groups can access housing wherever it is in Oakland. Housing locations should also further opportunity. Opportunity mapping is another state requirement that shows where low-income residents have access to positive economic, educational, or environmental outcomes. As defined by this methodology, low resource areas are shown in the purple here, and the high resource areas in the aqua. We know that all neighborhoods have assets, strengths, and resources, but this mapping of resource outcomes coincides largely with disinvestment and historic patterns of housing discrimination. Location of housing sites also must demonstrate equitable distribution of housing, including planning for affordable housing in high resource areas. It also bears mentioning that housing of any type should not be concentrated in just one part of the city. Finally, while racial and ethnic integration is the goal, it's also important to simultaneously look at housing locations in the context of gentrification and displacement. Based on typologies created by the Urban Displacement Project out of UC Berkeley, nearly half of households are affected by gentrification and a quarter are affected by displacement in Oakland. Gentrification is a related but separate process than displacement. While gentrifying areas are those with increasing housing costs, areas experiencing displacement have lost lower income households. Exclusive areas in the orange there are higher income areas that are difficult for lower income households to move to. Housing sites should be selected in a way that minimizes displacement pressures and opens up opportunity in exclusive areas. We'll talk more about your ideas for strategies to address displacement concerns at the 3rd workshop. So planning for housing in Oakland, what we would like to discuss with you today, where should it go? So we will first start, an essential component of the housing element is to identify sufficient sites that can accommodate future housing needs across income levels, as we've mentioned. 2 categories of sites that we know we can count towards that RHNA number are the pipeline projects, or housing that will be ready for people to move into after June 30th of this year. And then accessory dwelling unit projections, like these little units here, also may be counted based on cities' current production trends. 2 other types of sites that are good for housing include ones that are publicly owned, and in some cases may be required to prioritize affordable housing. And then vacant sites that are zoned residential are likely candidates. Other sites are possible but more challenging. So while non-vacant sites that currently have non-residential uses could be redeveloped as housing, it's a bit more difficult than these other 2. So as an example, if the land is worth more than the building on top of it, owners could have an incentive to redevelop. Finally, non-vacant sites that currently have residential uses could be upzoned to allow for more housing. We'll be talking about SB9 and SB10 and fourplexes at our next workshop. So what are the steps that we need to get to our inventory? We're starting at a place where we're looking for sites that have a good likelihood of developing as housing at various income levels. Then we calculate how much housing is likely to result from those sites. Once we have that number, we compare it to the RHNA levels, and we see if we need to find more sites, which could include some of those more difficult sites for development that I mentioned. We then assess the sites using a number of considerations that I had mentioned in the slides earlier. Do they further equity? Are they big enough? Are there constraints on the sites? Have they been identified by the community as important sites to include? So I'm going to stop sharing here and open up another share to show you what we've done so far to map these sites. So we are developing an inventory of sites on an interactive tool called Maptionair, where we are hoping to get your input on where housing should go. It will be available on the city's website tomorrow. And what it includes, just go to the next layer, is the opportunity to switch the base map if you'd prefer a light box mode. And in these layers here, we have mapped all of the constraints that I mentioned. And then we've started to take a look at where certain options for sites could go. And some of these include the major projects list. I'll turn this off and on so you can see where those are. And those are the projects that are going to develop and be ready for occupancy after June. So those can be counted. Sites in the city's vacant housing or vacant inventory. Those are also good candidates for housing. Sites that were included in the last RHNA, and we will be assessing why those sites did not develop, but they are still available for development in this cycle. Potential sites that the city has identified as being options for housing, like Mills College, for example. Sites in specific plan areas, including the Broadway Valdez specific plan area, West Oakland specific plan. And then we also have the downtown Oakland specific plan as well. But what we're doing with that is another deeper dive into sites that could actually redevelop in this 8-year period, because specific plans are usually for longer. So just want to reiterate that this is a draft map. We will be adding sites, we will be removing sites to it, but you can use this tool to help to show where sites potentially could be, and then how hazards might overlap with where those are. The map also includes the opportunity map that I was showing on slides before, and displacement typology that you can turn on and off. We'll have this open for 10 days, and an email will be sent when the map is ready. And then what you can do is drop a pin on specific locations. If you know this site is in my neighborhood, it's been vacant for a long time, and it's also kind of close to BART. So I'm going to drop a pin here, and then I'm going to say good transit access. So that's what we're hoping to get your input on later, and start to form the basis for discussion in small groups later on. So I'll stop sharing that. Keep an eye out for that map in the next few days, tomorrow. And then I know that was a lot to throw at you, but I want to pause here and offer some time for questions. And I'll turn it over to Lakshmi to address those.
I see Liana has her hand up. Ms. Molina.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. My question with regard to potential sites is whether or not we're talking about currently vacant sites that could be habitable, or sites in which there could be construction of new affordable housing. So if you could clarify that for me, and I apologize if I missed that detail.
Yes, so we are looking at the vacant sites that currently are in the city of Oakland, and we will also be looking at projects that will receive a certificate of occupancy after June 30, 2022, right? Yeah. And the next, Ms. Risa, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to.
Yes, it's Risa Jaffe, thank you.
Risa Jaffe, yeah.
I haven't heard any mention of social housing, and I don't see how we're solving the housing problem we have here in Oakland until we actually have a real conversation about the importance of that. The word affordable housing has been stretched so much that the definition of affordable is not really affordable to the people who really need it. And I think the only way we really address this issue is when we talk about social housing, and I'm disappointed that that has not come up.
Okay, sorry, this is Laura Kaminsky. I'll add, That is also part of why we are talking to you all today, because we want to get your insights into things that should be added for not only for opportunity sites, but also what housing policies and programs the city should be having as well as part of the housing element. So thank you for your input.
Mr. Levin, Jeffrey Levin.
Thank you. Jeff Levin with East Bay Housing Organizations. The outline you showed earlier showed that the housing element includes an assessment of past performance, a needs assessment, and I think most importantly in this round, a fair housing assessment. The city's identification of sites needs to explicitly link its sites to the fair housing assessment and how those sites actually overcome the structural barriers to fair housing that are identified. Has the city produced a fair housing assessment that we can all look at to see if the city has got it right and assess whether sites that are being identified are actually addressing the need to affirmatively further fair housing?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Levin. So we are currently in the process of analyzing past accomplishments as part of the previous housing element cycle, and we are also working on the requirements, the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements. So all that will be presented and available for public review once we are done with it. This initial round is, this initial workshop is to gather feedback on any additional sites that we should be looking at or any additional areas that in the city of Oakland that we should be looking at. Allison, do you want to clarify it further, add anything more?
Yeah, we're looking for sites that it could be vacant sites that are likely to redevelop, or if you want to highlight areas in the map, say along certain commercial corridors, for example, you're more than welcome to do that as well. All input on what sites or areas of the city you think would be appropriate for housing, that's what we want to know about. And I will clarify that this will not be the last time that you can provide input on this. There will be other opportunities to give input on sites, and then especially during the draft release, there will be a period of time where you'll be able to comment on whether or not there are areas that we missed or anything like that as well.
Thank you. I also wanted to mention that we might not be able to take all the questions today. So if you can put your questions in the chat, we can take it down and provide answers as an FAQ. In addition, I saw some comments about the map being available only for 10 days. So this is only, like Allison mentioned, the preliminary consideration of sites. We still have to go, but once we get the preliminary identification of sites, staff have to go back and do analysis on how much capacity these sites can hold in order to accommodate affordable housing. So there will be additional opportunities for everybody to respond. So this 10 days is only to provide your input on any additional sites that you want to consider in that interactive map. Thank you. Mr. Bowling.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to know, does the city have a list of opportunity sites they're currently investigating and the likelihood of development for each one of those opportunity sites that we could see? And is that available when we go through this tool so that we can just avoid trying to pinpoint likely sites that your staff is already kind of digging into to see if those property owners want to look at possible redevelopment?
Yes, Allison, do you want to take that with respect to the tool?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I can try to answer it, Allison. I heard the question.
Go ahead, Rashid.
Mr. Bowling, the tool will be available to you starting tomorrow. It's an initial assessment of the sites. You can definitely take a look at that starting sometime tomorrow. And you don't need to go through if you truly believe that some sites need to be re-emphasized, let us know. But it'll have all of the sites out there. Again, I want to emphasize, this is a starting place. We wanted to put it out there for your review, for your consideration, so you can add information to this. And as we finalize the sites, we will definitely have the affirmatively furthering fair housing evaluation available to us. in just a few weeks' time, so that we'll be using your input, all of the technical analysis, and all of the other data that we have to be identifying more sites that can be, providing opportunities for all income levels, which is what state law requires us to do. Thank you.
Are you also looking at a Howard terminal? That was my only final, sorry.
Laura may want to respond to that. I don't have an answer to that yet.
I mean, we are certainly going to be looking at all potential sites, and I think obviously we still have to kind of see until that's all approved, but I think it is definitely something we can be looking at as potential sites and see how that proceeds.
Next, I have on my list Phoenix Armenta.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering, I put this in the chat, but I was wondering, like, what are the sort of powers of the housing element, and what are the parameters of the powers of what it can do? Like, can we change policy with this, or, is it more of a recommendation, or is it this, whatever comes into this policy is something that we have to do?
Yes, so the housing element will include policies and programs to further production of affordable housing and also preservation of existing housing. And it will also make sure that the sites that we are considering are located equitably throughout the city. So it's not just going to be focused on housing, it's going to be a combination of housing and supporting policies and programs that further development, production, preservation, and protection of affordable housing.
And I would add that it is law. It'll be city law. These will not just be suggestions. Somebody else had also previously in the written questions asked, why are we doing this? Is this just a suggestion of the city council? No, it's a requirement of state law that we have a housing element. Bill Gilchrist said that we also need it very much, if you were there for his presentation earlier on. So it's a requirement of state law for us to be doing this every 8 years. We need the new element to be placed in January of next year. So by having these sites here, having these programs here, they come along with a set of both the programs as well as certain rights that are sort of given to the developers or property owners of these sites for them to be able to move through the city system more smoothly than they otherwise would in a nutshell, so to say. So that's the sort of, I was just adding on, and that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, but I encourage everybody participating in this workshop to either post your questions in the chat, or you can send it to us as an email at generalplan@oaklandca.gov. So the next person that I see on my screen is Madeline Johnson.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you. I was the June 20th date. Now I got a little confused about, is that for remodeling current properties, or is that for building new properties?
Can you please repeat your question?
The June 2022 date, is that for housing of people in already built or converted housing, or is that for building new housing?
No, that the June 30, 2022 date is for projects that we can include as part of the RENA allocation numbers that the state requires us to include. So these are projects that will not have their certificate of occupancy. These are projects that will get their certificate of occupancy after June 30, 2022.
Yeah, so Ms. Johnson, there is actually a 6-month overlap between the two housing element cycles. The previous one doesn't, end until later, and this one starts a little earlier. So state law allows us to count the units in those 6-month period toward meeting the requirements that have been established for Oakland. That's all that there is to that. It's an accounting kind of an issue more than anything else.
Oh, thank you.
All right, if there are any other questions, please add to the chat. We will capture them and we'll address in a FAQ to be released after the workshop as well. So next thing we want to do is have a discussion with all of you, talk to each other face to face. So we will be moving into breakout rooms. We ask that for some ground rules, we ask that people respect each other's opinions. The breakout room discussion will last around 40 minutes. Facilitators will take notes and capture the points of discussion and then confirm with you that everything was captured correctly. And then we will have a report back after that period of time where we'll share the key themes. And we're asking that facilitators keep report backs to just about 2 minutes. So there will be 4 questions that we can answer today. People have been putting a lot of great suggestions and comments in the chat. So I think question number 1 will be a great one to start off with. But then what we are looking for too is input on some of the opportunities for planning new housing in Oakland. Are there specific areas? What are your ideas around that? I saw churches recommended in the chat. What do you think some of the issues or challenges will be in these areas? And then if you want to provide input too on what you think the type of housing that Oakland needs more of, where you think it should go and why, all of that will be great. But we will break out into small groups. We are eager and happy to hear what you have to say, and we're in this together. We know that you hold the answers, so we'll be listening.
Thank you. I'll use you as a segue then. Welcome back to the main room, everybody. I hope you all had productive, enjoyable breakout rooms, speaking with other Oaklanders and talking about housing. We're gonna do a facilitator report back now. So I'll call on facilitators, and I was one, so I'll go first. But we will all give a couple bullet points of main points in our conversation. And so my group was just talking about how one of the challenges for building housing in Oakland is there are policies and regulations that can be onerous that prohibit people from building as much as they want to, that make it hard for people to build in general housing. And so really looking at those to make sure that like people are being held accountable to meet RHNA numbers as the city moves forward. My group was very pro housing across the board, all of Oakland. Would love to see people adding housing in a lot of different types and a lot of diverse different kinds of housing. They had great ideas about taller buildings being more downtown or near transit, fourplexes and existing single family neighborhoods, but really emphasizing that there are opportunities to add housing kind of across the board, and that should be made easier for both landowners, and also would love to see the city as an active partner in helping people build that kind of housing. We also talked about, empowering landowners, streamlining the process for developers and for private residents who want to add more units, and more homes for more Oaklanders. So Rajiv, I'll call on you next because your group joined us.
Sure, thank you. Our group was blessed with having a council member, a fire captain who's worked in the city, as well as residents. So we had lively discussion. San Pablo Avenue was mentioned as a great place for more affordable mixed income housing in the future, has not received as much attention as Broadway and Telegraph Avenue in the past. Look at smaller sites, don't forget about those. A stadium area, great place for housing, and any other place where there is transit or transit is planned for. The fire captain reminded us that he's worked for Oakland for 20 plus years, has always wanted to live in the city, has not managed to afford to do so. So we should not forget about workforce housing in addition to income restricted housing. They're just folks who make regular incomes who also want to live in the Oakland. It's also critical from emergency response purposes that policemen and firemen be able to live in the city. Castro Valley had an emergency living response zone, which prioritized living for emergency personnel. And many police personnel and fire personnel would love to, live in the city if they can afford to do so. Our group had differences of opinion of housing in the hills. Some believing that absolutely no additional housing there should be allowed for safety reasons, where others believe that single-family zoning should be eliminated from the entire city for the sake of equity. Moving on to another topic, people mentioned, several of our group members mentioned that while it's great to look at areas of opportunity to put in new housing, we actually need to put in housing where people live. People who'll move into this housing because people have cultural ties. They have ties with the neighborhoods. They have connections there. And we should continue to plan for housing in these lower income areas as well, and not just put housing in the wealthier areas. For many of our group members, preservation of housing at risk for conversion was a huge priority as well. These developers need city funding, need other funding, and the city should also be looking to give funding for smaller, less than 5-unit developments. Also, our group, and I heard, just the last pieces of your discussion, our group favors having on-site inclusionary housing building requirements rather than developers just being able to pay a fee and not have to build housing at the site. Thank you.
Thanks, Rajiv. Allison, your group?
Sure, I had a great discussion with my group. We talked about one theme that kind of came up a lot is the fact that many of these landowners look like they're just kind of city domain or a vacant land tax. And by that, I mean, I think San Francisco is exploring something similar now, where the longer a property sits vacant, the more tax there would be on it. We also talked about ideas for an affordable housing overlay, which would be an area where affordable housing could get, maybe more stories or some kind of bonus where market development would get less. We talked about urban land trusts, where some property owners might be able to donate their where did I find it? I think their property tax difference. Group, please jump in if you need to correct me. Some of the challenges that we discussed were just finding funding for affordable housing in general and the high cost of land in Oakland. Some of our no-go areas for housing include the fire hazard zones in the hills. We also discussed needing to plan for sea level rise and noted that some of these structures that are closer to the shoreline will lose their value as the sea level rises, in addition to being a hazard. And then also considering what impacts industrial land uses might have on housing uses. Our go areas included those that had good proximity to transit. And then we did not get fully into what housing types were desired, but we did discuss a lot finding places for people who are unhoused to live. Thanks.
Thank you.
On the housing, basically the idea was that people might be able to donate part of the equity value of their property and to an urban land trust. So that would allow the land trust to be able to have the property at a lower cost.
Great, thanks, Stuart, for making that connection. Appreciate
it. Daniel from City.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining the conversation this evening. I was fortunate to have a great group. We had a good lively discussion that had a diversity of opinions and viewpoints. Some of the summary points that were made really kind of revises zoning in such a way that more housing can be accommodated, whether that's upzoning, finding solutions for buy rate approvals for 100% affordable projects, housing near transit, really set the table to accommodate more and more housing. On the other side, there was one participant who believed that more housing necessarily wasn't the solution, but rather, the addressing the root causes of why housing is still unaffordable, the person cited that developers are sitting on empty properties, and that's kind of driving up the cost for people that actually would be able to take advantage of empty units, and advocated for finding solutions to assess the housing needs for families, and addressing the fair housing needs, and kind of evaluating how kind of the rent burdens that some families experience, but also there was discussions of housing in parking lots, underutilized parking lots of commercial areas, as well as potentially maybe affordable housing in high-rise buildings. There was discussion of not mixed income buildings, but rather mixed income neighborhoods entirely. We got a bit into discussion about transitional age youth housing, some senior housing, and then finally the point was emphasized that the city really needs to publish the fair housing assessment and housing needs assessment on the website so that the public can really kind of dig into the details of the report and be able to weigh on it. So thank you.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry to not have my internet camera on, but I've got poor internet here at the house. So my group, we talked about some particular housing opportunity sites, like the vacant commercial property at 51st and Broadway, that the former Safeway site there, as well as some other properties that people mentioned. But primarily we talked bigger picture about how to increase home ownership opportunities. We're building lots of apartments, but very few opportunities for people to actually own and have generational wealth transmission through that home ownership. And all throughout the city, with a particular emphasis in East Oakland as well. We talked about making particular outreach to the faith community and as a way to get the word out, but also to engage their very large portfolio of real estate to see if what housing opportunities they may have with properties that the faith community own and throughout the city. There was we also looked at a affordable housing overlay. One example was recently adopted in the city of Berkeley, and that there was a link put to that in our chat. So I'll be following up on that and seeing if that might be a good model for Oakland, because that's something we definitely have already talked about as a possible way to further incentivize some of the sites that we'll be putting forward. If there's anyone that was in my group that that want to mention anything that maybe I didn't mention in this brief overlay, please feel free to do so. I think that summarizes things pretty well. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, this is just me. I'm moving people along. Sorry. I think you guys are doing a great job reporting back. Audrey from the city, your group.
Thanks, Hazel. So our group talked about the need to build more affordable housing, especially at the very low income and extremely low income levels. And this should be distributed equitably across the city. We talked a lot about the challenge of funding affordable housing and the need to identify more local funding sources, potentially city sources, to build affordable housing. We talked about the need also to streamline the permitting process to reduce cost, especially for affordable housing developers. And we also talked about the possibility of streamlining the funding and tax credits process to reduce some of the administrative burden for affordable housing developers and all the legwork they have to go through for that. We also talked about converting existing buildings such as office spaces to housing or providing more units in those existing buildings and using the California Historical Building Code to facilitate this and also bring down costs. And that's all for me.
Thank you. Deanna?
Thank you. We also had a really good discussion. My team mostly focused on building affordable, how do we build affordable, walkable neighborhoods that are served by reliable transit and that can also provide a wide range of housing types that can sustain all life stages. We discussed, we brought up the question of how effective are impact fees, and would it be more efficient to require sort of inclusionary housing? We talked about building development along BART and kind of taking advantage of BART as a prime opportunity to develop transit-oriented development, develop housing, and then sort of we've had this discussion around how do we taking advantage of where transit is now, but then also thinking about where are places where we can push transit out to and can then develop more housing around those areas. So the MacArthur corridor was mentioned as an opportunity. We also talked about repurposing empty buildings for housing. So for example, given the impact the pandemic has had on office space, can we, is there an opportunity to convert existing commercial spaces into residential? We talked about missing middle housing and kind of creating the idea that every neighborhood is its own village, and then how can we kind of create neighborhood centers and promote missing middle housing, 3 or 4 story buildings at neighborhood centers throughout the city. And then lastly, we talked about sort of the region and thinking about our housing strategy in the context of the region. I think that covers it. Another important, one more point, just joining forces with other agencies to build affordable housing such as BART.
Thank you. And I do want to be a little bit mindful of time. We have 10 minutes left and 7 groups left for report back. So I'm going to call on you if you could try to please keep it brief, noting that there will be a report that goes out that summarizes what everyone talked about. Claire, your group?
Sure. Thanks, Hazel. So my group had a really interesting discussion on climate resilience and what that looked like. We talked a lot about developing dense transit-oriented housing, having folks closer to amenities that are accessible by transit. There were some concerns about the past RENA allocation and how it exceeded for above moderate income groups, but fell short for some of the lower income groups and how that could be changed the next time around. Also talks about incentivizing developers in building affordable units, expediting and streamlining the system for this as well as for ADUs. We talked about some issues regarding NIMBY views, preventing displacement and gentrification as some of these housing sites go up, and also looked into how we could address blighted sites and have those redeveloped or reutilized and circularized. Thanks.
Thank you. Lakshmi, your group?
Thank you, Hazel. So our group also had a good discussion. So I can categorize these discussions into like 4 main topics. So one was on sites, the other one on policies, on equity, and then on education and engagement. So the group strongly agreed or suggested that we need to evaluate our policies using an equity lens so that we can fix more systemic issues, and the policies that we are looking at in the housing element and in the general plan update should also address the unhoused. There was also a suggestion to look at our redistricting mapping to identify equity patterns and how that impacts the general plan update. As far as sites are concerned, there were suggestions about including city-owned properties and also looking at properties that are owned by land trust groups or developers, because developers are buying large swaths of land and they're letting it go blighted or vacant. So if there's a way the city can buy back these properties, then the city would be able to develop them. And as far as policies are concerned, there was strong agreement on requiring on-site inclusionary housing. And if the money is going into an affordable housing impact fee, what is the accountability, or where is the accountability mechanism set in to identify what those monies are used for and how those monies are being used for? And finally, the last few comments focused on engagement and education, mainly education on what affordable housing means and how do we communicate what we are speaking in easy to understand language, and being as transparent as possible, because with these timelines, how do we make sure that we are listening to the community and bringing back their feedback and incorporating them in the policies and the guidelines? And finally, increasing accessibility by providing translations in easy to understand languages in multiple languages, and also providing materials that other cultural groups or community groups can take it back to their trusted spaces and then provide the feedback back to the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, our group talked about some of that as well. Matt, your group?
Thanks, Hazel. Yeah, we talked about, we had a great conversation. We talked a lot about the general process and making sure the community has enough context to understand what the housing process looks like, and so they can select appropriate sites. We also talked about some housing locations as well, including that we need to locate affordable housing in higher resource neighborhoods near transit. And there's capacity for redevelopment in places like Trestle Glen, Montclair, North Oakland, and the Hills. Although in the Hills, we should keep fire risk in mind. But it is possible to build in fire risk zones with enough strategic planning and foresight. Make sure also to spread density around the city and not concentrate in small pockets, and to not exacerbate patterns of segregation. We also talked about type of housing, including rental and ownership, ADUs, et cetera, and modular housing. And also not to include grocery stores as sites in the inventory. We also talked about making sure the proportion of affordable housing to market rate housing is higher in new development, including in any new Coliseum area redevelopment, and to make sure to not redevelop existing subsidized or rent-controlled housing. And then finally, we also talked a little bit about some policy ideas and solutions, including strengthening the housing preservation program, talked a little bit about inclusionary housing, value capture of resale, more transparent community benefits process, streamlining for modular housing, especially on small sites, encouraging workforce housing, and thinking about converting vacant ground floor commercial to residential units.
Thank you. Laura, your group?
Yeah, so my group also seemed to be very much in favor for inclusionary housing or building on-site affordable, and really making sure that all, when market rate projects are being built, that the affordable is being built as part of those projects. I think there was concern brought up about the Howard Terminal project that's proposed and how they're not going to be building affordable on site. Also, there's just concerns in general about how zoning is and the systemic racism policies of the past, and really that essentially you need to do really a whole overload of change of how the way the system works and how zoning and zoning is going to continue to essentially segregate people. Also concern about with developers that are buying up housing, and sort of, I think we heard some of that from other groups of just holding on to them and then flipping them. And so really sort of this issue too of I know city has a vacancy tax, but how is that working, and trying to encourage people to not sit on their land, and we need to ban land speculation. Also, there's concern of where the affordable housing is being built. So that should be being built across the city. And also heard from someone in my group who lives in affordable housing as saying essentially that, where their housing is located is near pollution sources, near the freeway. And also there's areas, of crime that's happening nearby. And so that really we need to look at where we're putting the affordable housing so that it's not being put essentially in areas, that are not safe for people to be living. Also trying to have affordable housing for people of, different income groups. Also areas that should also have access to grocery stores and other resources. Let's see here, sorry. Also, I think one of the things which I heard other people saying as well is just making it easier for everyday person to build housing, and that the process of the city right now is just too complicated. And can the city maybe provide more staff that can help people, assist people who are not your big developers, the average person, in being able to build housing or an ADU or whatever it may be, so that they can actually, help in this process, and not just for big developers. And let's see, and also I think just a lot of concern too about being able to buy housing, that the cost of housing in general has gotten very expensive in Oakland, and really it's hard for even somebody making six figures to even purchase a house is really impossible. And also just other ways of getting money for the city, whether that is changing the business tax way and increasing money that's generated from the port, and not supporting corporations that are not paying living wages. And hopefully let me know maybe from our group if there's something that I missed.
Thank you. Kalila, your group?
Hi, so I'll try to be quick. So our group talked about a lot of things. We talked about the city's needs to prioritize very low and low income affordable housing in the areas of the arena that are not being met. We talked about the lack of accountability and performance metrics in the city's affordable housing policies, and that we need to build those in. We talked about the need to increase the development impact fees so that developers are paying more, because the cost of building affordable housing and market rate housing has really gone up, and there are a lack of state and federal funds to support affordable housing. And so how can we sort of address this model that we currently use of using market rate housing to pay for affordable housing? Can we do something else, like using public land for public good? We need to go big to address the homelessness issue, because what we've done so far has not worked whatsoever. We want to keep Black people in Oakland. We want to keep Black properties in Black hands. And can we do Black home ownership strategies? Can we do strategies to support renters to owners and tenants directly? And being able to upzone and build housing near transit corridors and BARTs, and being careful with upzoning, and be sure to do it equitably, so that areas that are at risk of gentrification displacement, like Fruitvale and Deep East Oakland, the residents there don't get pushed out because of the city's upzoning work. I think that's more about it.
Thank you. Lauren?
Thanks, Hazel. Yep. So some things we talked about were affordable housing should be built all over Oakland and not just in lower income neighborhoods. Affordable housing near transit is key. Being next to the BART opens up far more opportunities than even just being 2 miles away. And we need to ensure that anti-displacement protections are in place for those who already live there when we do transit-oriented development. We need more senior supportive housing, multi-generational housing, workforce housing, and ADA compliant housing. An issue is affordable housing is built, but people who can pay market rate end up getting it. We need to ensure affordable housing is not built near pollution sites. We need to make sure the unhoused is housed before anything else. We need to make sure vacant units and vacant land are not sitting vacant. Homegrown solutions such as community land trusts should be seen as real solutions, and we should remove the barriers to these solutions. Some homegrown solutions have run into a lot of issues with the city, and homelessness was cited as an example. We need to ensure businesses are not displaced during large construction projects. We need to ensure affordable housing exists not only now, but also in the future, so that future generations can remain in Oakland. And we need to recognize housing as a human right and not a commodity.
Thank you. And then Helen, last but not least, your report back.
Thanks, Hazel. So we covered a lot of the same things that have come up, so I'll be brief. We talked about incorporating data analysis that's already happened on equity issues and kind of placing housing around the city, focusing higher density housing in commercial areas such as College Avenue and Rockridge, and then finding ways for the city to incentivize specifically low and very low income housing, and even pausing market rate development until there's enough low and very low income housing being built. And then again, the issue of finding housing for the unhoused population in Oakland and taking, kind of paired with that, taking advantage of the vacancies that exist, whether that's vacant rentals or short-term rentals, and finding ways to get people into housing.
Awesome. Allison or Lakshmi, do you want to take us away with next steps?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for all the great feedback. So like we mentioned, so there is an exit poll that you can take as part of this workshop so that we can know what more topics you want to see at future workshops and how we can improve outreach moving forward. But I also wanted to let you know that in addition to these workshops, our community consultant team that Allison mentioned, the Deeply Rooted Collaborative, is holding a lot of fun celebratory cultural hub events and also pop-ups. Even though we call them pop-ups, what they mean is we are going to where people are at and we are engaging with them. These could be at a Coma Market, membership meetings at various community-based organization membership meetings, and there will also be youth engagement. In addition, the Deeply Rooted Collaborative team will also convene an equity working group that will be comprised of members of the community who are already involved in environmental justice, addressing air pollution and other key issues. For instance, on February 6th, there was an event at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center as part of the Lunar New Year celebrations. And as part of that event, the Deeply Rooted team in collaboration with the city prepared this design that identifies the timeline of Asian Americans and how their experience has been in Oakland. And this design was present, this available both in Cantonese and English, in Chinese and English. And we also had members of the general plan team engaging with the community members in both English and Cantonese, getting their feedback and thoughts on how they want to be engaged and what are their key issues around housing, environmental justice, and safety. So there are going to be several other workshops, and then as we are working to the schedule, working on the schedule, we will update the website with additional workshops. And yes, I will post, we will be posting links to design online. So every event page after the event, within a week, we try to post the feedback materials and any other outreach materials that were present at the workshop. So please sign up for any email updates and sign up to receive email updates, and the workshops will be updated with the upcoming dates and event dates. Thank you. And the interactive map will also be available online, and we will send out an email with the link. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Please sign up for updates too at the Oakland website here. We're very grateful for all of your feedback. Thank you so much for your ideas, and we look forward to continuing to shape this housing element and the general plan for Oakland.